Let's get started with our first session of the day, and I'm excited to welcome back Victoria Stamper, General Manager of the United Potato Growers of Canada. Victoria is going to kick things off with an update on the 2024-25 crop season, provide us some information on the U.S. and European harvest and production, and some issues to keep on our radar. So take it away, Victoria.
Thank you very much, Bree. Okay, wonderful. Just before I get started on my presentation, I wanted to say thank you to Potatoes in Canada for inviting me to speak on behalf of United today. Um, these types of collaborations I find are really important for the industry as a whole. So really glad to be a part of it. And for those not familiar with United Potato Growers of Canada, we're a nonprofit organization working on behalf of potato growers across Canada with members in every major potato producing province. Our mission is to provide potato industry information, intelligence, and analysis that allows producers to make timely and good informed production and marketing decisions. So that's who we are. But if you have any questions, obviously in the Q&A, please feel free to jump in. So maybe we can start with just a few facts about potatoes in Canada. Most of you should be familiar with this, but for those who are joining us from other industries or other commodities, as of 2021, we haven't had a more recent survey, but there were 951 potato farms in Canada. Production in 2024 was 126, just over almost 127 million hundredweight, so a pretty good crop in 2024. We'll go into more of that in detail. Total sales over 2 billion Canadian dollars in the last marketing season, 2023-24. The average potato yield in Canada per harvested acre, hundredweight per harvested acre, is 331. And the major growing provinces still in acres, PEI still comes up at the top at 85,000 acres, and then followed by Manitoba and Alberta. So still the similar producing provinces. Seed acres certified in Canada, just over 58,000 in 2024. So a good seed industry in Canada. So how has the industry been performing historically? Just a quick graph to show you. We go about all the way back to 2003 up to 2024. So the planted acreage is the background in green there. The blue shows the production numbers and the yield trend line up there in red. And we can see that although our planted acres haven't reached the peak back in 2003 of over 457,000 acres, we can see that production actually has surpassed. Back then, with the assistance, of course, of steadily increasing yields, production has certainly surpassed previous levels. And so how have we done this year? So we talked about historical. Now let's look at this crop season. Hopefully you can see those statistics, but it's just a quick chart showing the overall facts and figures. Just over 391,000 acres planted, harvested acres 383,666, an overall yield for the country 330.9, and production of 126, like I said, almost 127 million hundredweight. Now we have to keep in mind that last year's crop had originally been reported at 128 million potatoes, so or hundredweight. So this year originally was a little bit lower, but there have been some revisions to the 2023 numbers that were published by AFC StatsCan in the end of the year in December. So now this year is actually the record crop for Canada. We can see a bit of a reversal of last year with higher production in the east, mainly due to much better weather conditions. That we had a lot of consistent rain through New Brunswick, Quebec, even into PEI and Ontario. And we can see the production, yes, shows a bit lower in the west, a lot of that having to do with some reduction in processing sector acreage in Alberta and Manitoba, and a little bit lower yields in Saskatchewan with weather conditions. So changes in planted acreage, we don't have to go through them all, but you can see the two in red I just mentioned, Alberta and Manitoba, and that was generally in the processing sector. The other areas did show increases, albeit not huge increases, but there were some increases in planted acreage. So just a bit of a shift, 2024 versus 2023. We are slightly down 0.3% overall, but as I said, most of that in the West. So as much as planted acreage is an important number, we do want to look at what actually was harvested. You can see highlighted in green the East Coast areas that we just talked about, with a marked improvement in harvested acreage this year. So not only what was pulled out of the ground, but what is marketable from storage. So definitely an improvement there. And although most of North America in general experienced some unseasonably warm temperatures in September and October, causing harvest to slow for some with partial dig days at the beginning, overall, most growers I spoke with were happy with how the harvest went, considering, especially compared to last year. Conditions were drier, which may have caused some issues in certain areas depending on the soil type, but much preferred, I think, to the solid rains of 2023. So we can see overall that we did have in Canada a slight increase in terms of harvested acres. So how did the planted acres fare in 2024? Across Canada, it was different regionally. Most started with an early spring. Planting went very, very well. The crop was moving along right until July. Some saying the best crop they'd seen, and then the weather Mother Nature pulled the rug out from under us. August went very, very dry for many. Ontario actually had some June rains that kind of switched things up for them. So in general, we can see that impacted in the yields. Most regions are either stable or down. We did see improvement in Washington and Colorado, as well as the Northeast, including Maine, New Brunswick, and Quebec, again, related to the better weather conditions this year over last, mostly due to lower precipitation in the East. And in the case of Washington, lower temperatures through the growing season, so less stress on the crop. So there was some improvement there. So this table provides a summary of the reporting states and provinces. Often I report the US production separate from the Canadian production. And there was a comment before, well, we'd like to see how we look at it in terms of North American production. So you do get to see the provinces highlighted in bold within the list of total all the US states and provinces here, including a comparison to the last 3 years. USDA in the US estimates that production is down about 22 million hundredweight, or 5.1% from the previous year, with 38,000 fewer acres planted and harvested, according to the USDA. Combined with lower yields we saw in the previous slide in the US, account for the overall drop in production, with close to half of that difference up here in Washington and Idaho alone. So you can see that we are producing just close to 127 million in all of Canada, and Idaho produces 135 million in their state alone. So they are definitely a force to be reckoned with. Washington would come in second. The majority of Washington potatoes, however, are destined for the processing sector. So the biggest fresh would definitely be in the state of Idaho, probably 60% to 40% for the processing sector. So of interest to you, however, might be, how does the increased harvested acres and yields in the Northeast of North America translate into production? So we not only have more potatoes in the bin that we got out of the ground, but we also have a more marketable crop. The issues of hollow heart and rot that we were seeing in the Northeast, including New Brunswick, Quebec, some even in PEI, are just really not present this year. And we believe that the pack out rates definitely are improving. But all of this region also experienced unseasonably warm temperatures through harvest. So how will that impact the long-term storage, and particularly on yellows, which can be subject to some issues in storage? So with that in discussion, there, because there was a bit of a concern maybe that with the increase in the fresh sector in the Northeast, How would the balance of supply and demand be? So I thought I'd take a look at the potato production in the Northeast on the left for all sectors, so all potatoes produced, which you can see here. And there was a difference there, 7.5% up over last year. However, we have to keep in mind that last year really was a tough year for most of this area with the rains consistently through the growing season. But if we separate out the fresh sector, so those destined for fresh potatoes, retail, and food service, we actually see that it's only 35% of the total potatoes produced, and that we are actually well in line with historical numbers. We are not way out of balance. It's you just see a big jump from last year because of the lower crop. So yes, it's a bigger crop, a bigger fresh crop in the bin and marketable, but we are actually fairly well balanced and not a large concern. So Canadian supply overall, total production, as I mentioned in Canada, is close to 127 million hundredweight, and originally down, but with the changes in production numbers for last year, we're actually a record crop this year in 2024. Um, and the 2024-25 crop overall has been very similar to conditions in the US. I'm going to get into the US supply in a bit. We're seeing a bit tighter inventory on reds. Yellow supplies are up. However, far from the russet surplus in the processing sector in Washington and Idaho that we saw in 2023. We have seen an increase in production in the east, as we talked about, where the majority of the fresh acres are grown. But the stocks in the table sector are generally more balanced, and certified acres are actually up in the seed sector as well, which is a good thing. The reductions, I've noted here that frozen processors and dehydrators have more than enough raw product. We saw some shortages in New Brunswick in the east last year. That is definitely not the case this year. But the reductions at Lamb Weston that many of you might have heard about, they closed a plant in Washington and have had reductions elsewhere, will have an impact in Alberta, but not necessarily directly in Manitoba. But there's definitely enough raw product across the country. Just a quick overview in terms of each sector within Canada. In the fresh sector, we estimate, these are estimates, United estimates based on discussions with our members across the country, but approximately 91,000 planted acres in Canada for the fresh sector and production at just over 46,000 hundredweight. Sorry, 46 million hundredweight. Surpluses of russets in the US are down from last year's record numbers, which is a good thing. The Section 32 buyouts, which is a USDA legislation they have in place to purchase surpluses and move them into the food bank network. They have contributed to some lower carton pricing in the US, which does have a spillover effect on pricing of cartons for food service in Canada. We are monitoring potatoes from the processing sector that they don't fall into the fresh market. The buybacks of Lamb Weston contracts that happened when they were closing there's been some that were moved into the fresh sector in Idaho, but that really has not been seen since. So we do keep an eye on that though. The exports to the US are definitely higher. From August through November were 9.6% higher than during the same period last year. Mostly probably due to our lower exchange rate, making our potatoes a little more attractive in terms of pricing, and also helped with improved pricing in the US compared to last year. In the processing sector, we estimate almost 198,000 acres were planted in Canada for potatoes and for frozen processing, and 48,000 acres for potato chips planted in 2024. Again, those are estimates, but it gives you an idea of the proportions in the market. I talked a little bit about the reductions at Lamb Weston, creating some excess in the Pacific Northwest, including in Alberta and Manitoba. Combined with better expected yields in those areas. So it does mean some regions are a bit long in processing, but the expansion in that sector continues. There's the Simplot Moses Lake in Washington that's coming on hopefully in 2026. The McCain in Coaldale plant in Alberta is supposed to be coming online this summer. And the latest announcement, the newest thing, is Agristo from Europe has chosen North Dakota for a new plant in North America and targeted for a 2028 opening. So the expansion and processing continues. The global demand for French fries also continues at a lower rate than previously forecast. We were originally around 3 to 5% per growth forecast in the last couple of years, and that's maybe slowed down to 1%. The seed sector was different regionally, depending on weather in different areas. In the Alberta, affected a little bit by precipitation. Quebec, in certain areas of the seed growing a little dry, and there are concerns that fewer acres under contract for the processing may impact the planting intentions in 2025. So something for the seed sector to think about. We also want to see if the trend from red to yellow varieties will continue. There are some that feel we have hit a plateau with the yellow varieties. Planting more acres plus getting the higher yields in these varieties has shown in the inventory levels this year. And just keep in mind in the seed sector, they have the high production costs as in the other sectors, but even higher risk, and something we need to work on and make sure we're keeping on track with our seed sector and supporting them. Current holdings, just quickly, if you see the lines in purple show this year, and you can see the trend line. The black one is 5-year, the red one is 3 years. And we are definitely still over that trend line of movement of holdings. But although storages are at record levels, if we continue on this current pace of movement, the table sector, we could clean up stocks in a matter of 5 months, leaving us potentially short before a new crop. However, keep in mind January and February are certainly slower than December, so we will probably see things moving well into the summer and the transition into the new crop. US supply, I talked a bit about that earlier. Total production is below their 5-year average. You can see that large jump in 2023 and the reduction in 2024. Most of that in Idaho, 8 million hundredweight, which is good for everyone in North America. I've talked about the carbon pricing, red potato, yellow potato demand and supply. It's a very similar situation in North America in terms of our overall production and supply. The European market, different situation. They had a very delayed planting, especially compared to North America. Good growing season though, but certain areas you can see the production down in Spain and Portugal. The UK is reporting probably the smallest crop on record. Other areas that got hit at the beginning, France, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, where the most of European production is undertaken. I did have more favorable growing seasons and did bounce back a bit in terms of yield. So good in terms of that. Some things they had impact of reliance on cut seed, which is not something they usually do in Europe, but had to because of some seed shortages. So, something to keep in mind in terms of the European crop and how that will be moving forward. There is consistent talk about seed shortages in Europe and how they can support the seed sector. So we want to keep that in mind here in North America as well. So where are we on demand? That's a lot about supply. Where are we on demand? We consumers still find good value with potatoes at the retail level. Quick service restaurants continue to expand. It might be hard to see those small things, but that's Tim Hortons, McDonald's, Starbucks, and A&W, who all feature potatoes on their menu. Maybe a little less at Starbucks, but very important that they're still expanding. And the volume bought with a US dollar. Potatoes are the colored lines in against all the blue. So we hold 3 of the top 5 spots in retail for produce. So it's still a good value. Demand continues to grow, and potatoes are still a high spot for consumers. I do want to touch before I finish off on the trade balance. I know there's a lot of concern about the tariffs, potential tariffs with the new president-elect in the US. You can't see the numbers. The important part to note is we are a net exporter of potatoes, and our government, our associations in Canada are definitely lobbying and making sure that people are aware tariffs are not good for people on either side of the border. So something to think about. What else is on grower minds? Potential rail strikes, the latest being Unifor in the Canadian Pacific, Kansas City voted for a strike if they don't come to an agreement January 29th. So that can be a potential issue. Port strikes, crop application and availability and cost. Many of the crop products are purchased in US dollars, so it does make an issue when we have a low exchange rate. Obviously, erratic weather, seed availability we've talked about, and the potential tariffs on the US exports. So what does that mean overall for growers, and what are we thinking about? There is a good supply in North America of potatoes, some potential surplus of processing potatoes in the Northwest, but that demand continues to grow to eat those up. Chip market is quite active, particularly in private label, where consumers are still looking to spend their dollar the best way they can. Food service trends, providing new opportunities, particularly the ready-to-eat market in retail, is providing new opportunities for Canadian growers. Input costs have generally stabilized, freight, fuel, etc., but the impact, as I mentioned, of our lower exchange rate moving forward on input costs can be definitely something on growers' minds. Exports to the US have actually been very strong this year to date. Generally, probably the attractiveness of the lower exchange. However, the threat of potential tariffs is definitely on growers' minds. And we want to make sure you understand that UPC will continue to work with other industry partners and keep an eye on this issue, obviously, and work with members to discuss potential contingency plans. The most important factor really is for us to come together as an industry and face these challenges together rather than divided. It's just more productive for us long term. So I think I'm at my time, so we'll just wrap up. Before I go, I would love to say a quick thank you to our valued sponsors. As a nonprofit organization, we also rely on the generosity of our industry partners to help us carry out our activities. We're really excited to welcome Volm Companies Canada in 2024 as our first national sponsor. And of course, we have several sponsors across Canada: Equipement Capital, Émile Sénéchal et Fils, Coder Packaging, l'Association des emballeurs de pommes de terre de Québec, Allen Equipment, Farm Credit Canada, PEI Bag Company, and Thomas Fresh. And we thank you for your continued support. We really appreciate it. So with that, I think I might have a little bit time left for questions. My email is there. You can reach out to me anytime, but I guess I'll pass it to Bree if
Well, you'll pass it to me, but it's really it's the Brienne Victoria show now. Thank you so much for your presentation, Victoria. It's always a pleasure to have you. And we do currently have one question in the Q&A. Any insights on virus level in seeds? It seems to go up lately. Any concerns? I'm not sure if you have an answer for that, but this person would love to know.
Yes, I do have a little bit of general information. I don't want to go too far into it. At United, I'll be very honest, we don't get into the science or research or agronomy as much as our colleagues at Canadian Potato Council. Um, so the only factor I have so far from a recent meeting, I know in PEI, they were at a 90% pass rate and virus levels were good, much better. And I'm hearing the same out of New Brunswick. I'm hearing the same out of Maine, much better than they were last year. And I would say the same out of Ontario, but I don't have any specific numbers that I can offer you, unfortunately. But
No worries. A reminder to everyone, if you have questions, we still have 7 minutes of Victoria's session. So, oh, and Philip has another question. Great. Just to remind everyone, type it in the Q&A and not the chat. So Philip asks, can you talk about seed supply from each province or region?
Okay, yeah, can I ask back specifically in terms of overall supply? How is the production, or were there specific variety questions?
Yeah, this just states seed supply. So Philip,
Okay,
if you're still sharp, if you mind elaborating on that.
yeah. I mean, in general, there is a concern in, say, BC, where seed sector has been declining continuing to decline. Alberta Seed Supply. In terms of Alberta this year, from what I understand, seed supply is good in Alberta. They are, I would say, a bit down possibly from last year in terms of overall production. I think it was a yield probably issue, but that would be the general case in Alberta. And again, Quebec seed sector as well did fairly well in terms of weather. So overall supply is good so far for 2024-25, but it can be very varietal in nature. So if you are looking for a specific variety, it could be a completely different story than what I'm talking about in terms of overall seed production.
We do have another question in the queue, and I'm afraid I'm having a bit of a hard time understanding this. There might have been
Uh,
a bit of error. Nothing in the presentation on potato. I think that means starch as
Starch.
powder. Great.
Yes, you're right. We don't track. United Potato Growers of Canada really started looking at the supply and demand of the fresh sector. So because the idea being, if you can start trying to balance the supply and demand in the fresh sector, you can help stabilize the pricing. Whereas in the processing industry, which would include the dehydrators, so potato starch and other products like that, a lot of that is contracted pricing, and United really doesn't get involved in that. The Processing Association, Marketing Association of North America, PMANA, we do work with them closely, Dale Latham, but they would certainly have more information in terms of specifics around that part of the processing sector. So, but feel free to reach out to me by email if you have more specific questions about that. I can certainly track down information for you from the PMANA.
Absolutely. And we really appreciate you and all the other speakers being so accessible.
Yeah.
This next person asks, what can we expect for 2025 when we think about supply and demand across North America? And do we expect any large shifts in planted acres versus 2024?
I don't see, we don't feel that there will be any large shifts. As I mentioned, there have been a trend of a shift within categories, so or type between yellows and reds. We're starting to see that sort of plateau. We don't think there will be as much of a switch from reds to yellows as that red inventory has tightened up and the yellow inventory has sort of expanded. Um, their only place that we see a potential in terms of larger shifts would be in the processing sector. So potatoes that are being planted destined for frozen processing due to that expansion that I talked about. So the Coaldale plant coming on in June will certainly have an impact on planting intentions. But again, that's a contracted situation. So it's not something necessarily that United would have that, but certainly is something to think about in terms of processing acres. But I don't see a big change in terms of fresh or seed. And a lot of that's due to land availability in the regions where those are grown, cost of land, et cetera. So there's a lot of factors going into the decision there.
Great. And as it's 12:33, this question from Willie is going to be our last question. A reminder, Victoria did post her email if anyone wants to reach out to her following today. Willie asks, are you seeing the trend line, any trend line movement to new varieties away from russet Burbank?
Yes, definitely a good question and a popular question. I mean, if you look at top 50 varieties planted even in North America, but Burbank still pops up to the top. If you talk to actual growers, they're not necessarily a fan. I even heard a comment that if you had to pass the Burbank today for a McDonald's French fry the Burbank might not even pass. So there definitely is, in terms of research into it and movement away to caribou, for example, is one that we've seen. Mountain Gem, we've seen as well popping up. But it's hard to make a big switch to that without having the approval of the people that are actually processing it into French fries. So I don't see a huge change in the near future until some of those other varieties would actually be approved by the customers, even of the processors. So they drive a lot of that decision making.
Good to know. All right. Well, thank you so much for participating today, Victoria. We really appreciate your presence and your presentation today.